For the Caribbean, there is the issue of a region that has had very sluggish growth. There is a bit of a recovery since 2009, but for the decade prior to that, the region actually posted negative economic growth. So the region has, on the one hand, this challenge of improving economic growth, which is important for addressing some of the human resilience issues in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean Human Development Report for 2016 makes 4 key points. The first is that the Caribbean is faced with this challenge of, on the one hand, boosting inclusive economic growth and at the same time building multidimensional progress. And the report makes the point that more stable, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth is important for multidimensional progress. We define multidimensional progress in terms of the sort of broad chapeau that we've been talking about. The second point is that there is increasing human vulnerability in the region. What we're seeing is growing multidimensional poverty, which is existing alongside very high poverty rates. And we're also seeing a deterioration and in some cases just a stagnation, meaning there isn't a sort of an improvement in the key human development indicators. And of course, there's the issue of the structural challenges in the region, which we know very well, the high debt, lack of fiscal space, and how those structural issues have, despite political will in the region to address some of the human development challenges, have really constrained or tied the hands of regional decision makers. And then the report also makes the point that the multidimensional approach that we present is very consistent with the Agenda 2030, and we believe that by pursuing a multidimensional approach, that the region would in fact be acting on the 2030 agenda. Now, to prepare this report, we struggled because we couldn't find that rich data for the Caribbean. We believe that one of the main contributions of the report is the fact that we're saying that this discussion in the region on vulnerability, which usually goes along the lines of, we're a highly indebted region, we're very exposed to exogenous shocks, financial crisis, and so on. As important as that is, we believe it's missing a very important element, and that is resilience and vulnerability at the household and the community level. I also mentioned the sort of sluggish performance. You'll see that between the period 2008, 2011, that there has been a little bit of a resurgence of growth in the region. And now the concern is, how do we ensure that that growth is inclusive? Because there's still a lot of inequities in the region, and how do we ensure that with a region that is now posting some positive growth, we can distribute that in an inclusive way. I mentioned the human development indicators, the health education, the multidimensional poverty indicators. Here we show actually the trend on the Caribbean's aggregate human development and country, and we would go country by country, the human development performance. For a lot of countries, we've seen a sort of not a sustaining of the gains that we see in previous decades, where there was a consistently increasing performance in the Human Development Index. And the report discusses the reasons why we're seeing this performance. We also make the point in the report that there is still persistent poverty. In fact, the weighted average poverty rate is about 43.7%, and this is based on the data that we do have. It would be great if we can update our poverty data in the region, but it's still very high, suffice to say. And we also show in the report, using the Gini coefficient, that there is still a high degree of income inequality in the region. A fundamental contribution of this report is we ask the question, which are the most vulnerable groups in the Caribbean? The groups that require serious public policy attention. And we didn't present an exhaustive list. Actually, the research, we came up with about 10 or 11, but we presented 6 in the report. Women, youth, indigenous people for those countries, children, elderly, and I think that's it. So we present these 6 groups, and what the report does is that it examines how these vulnerability outcomes are created, what are the factors that make these groups vulnerable, and we present a very, we believe, nuanced assessment of how different types of vulnerabilities interact to create certain outcomes. We also look at youth, particularly the issue of youth unemployment, which we know is very, very high in the Caribbean. The youth unemployment rate is twice the unemployment rate of adults, and it particularly affects young females. Of course, there's the issue that women are indeed outperforming men in the education system, which has been touched on this morning. But then in terms of labor market integration, we're still seeing some inequality and the way how the labor market treat women in the Caribbean. We also make the point that by addressing youth unemployment, you could in fact be impacting very directly on your GDP performance, and this is using some data that we got from the Caribbean Development Bank, and they did a very, very deep assessment of the youth unemployment situation in the Caribbean. And they show across the different countries. Again, this data, some countries, as you can imagine, had better data than others, but we tried our best. But we do show that youth unemployment has personal, household, and national costs, and the report identifies and discusses some of those costs. Now, in terms of the analysis on the factors that move people in and out of poverty, and we believe that this is very important for the region, unfortunately we were only able to do it based on the data from Jamaica. And what we looked at is what are the chances of being poor, and what are the factors that increases the chances of being poor specifically, as against what are the chances of sliding back into poverty. And you'll see some factors such as poor housing quality, educational assistance from friends or relatives from non-urban areas, access to public water. On the one hand, are factors that affect chances of being poor, as against factors that affect the chances of sliding back into poverty, where we look at what we do see is that not middle class nor poor, but what we call vulnerable households. There is not a dependency, but there is a higher level of remittances going into vulnerable households. And that might just be because of sort of educational attainment. Those households that are sort of transient. They're not quite yet in the middle class, but they have been able to, have better education, better access, and so on. Just on the future agenda, we have been making the point about, where does the Caribbean go on some of these issues? How does the Caribbean address, on the one hand, the inclusive growth issues, and on the other hand, the human development related issues? And the report presents 3 broad set of, let's call them policy baskets that Caribbean policymakers can address. The first has to do with the human and social development challenge, and what kinds of policies are necessary at this juncture in the history of the region to advance on human and social development and to sort of arrest the sort of stagnating performance that we've seen. We also look at importantly, the inclusive economic growth prospects for the region, and we present what we call enablers of economic growth. We look at what are those sectors where the Caribbean does have some comparative advantage, and we talked about how to sort of address. And then we talked about, finally, the third basket, the environmental sustainability and resilience, and the whole need for better risk-informed development planning. So, how do you factor the fact that you will have natural disasters into the development planning? What does that mean for policy, housing policy, infrastructure policy, population policy, and these kinds of things? How do you factor that in when you're, making decisions on where to invest in the development in the region? And so finally, we talked about what we call prerequisites for addressing those baskets. We don't believe that the region can go immediately to those issues unless they do a few things. One is the issue of availability, quality, and use of data. which we know very well. The second is public participation in policy making and evaluation processes. That needs to strengthen. And how do we actually address some of the systems and the lack of capacity within institutions, and what might be some strategies for addressing. So we talked about the systems, tools, the technologies, the processes, and looking at it at the various levels, the national, municipal, the local level. How can the region work on those issues? So in conclusion, very quickly, the report looks at economic growth, because as we know, it's important for the region, especially given the last decade's performance. We talked about addressing the structural vulnerabilities, energy diversification, reducing the burden of public debt, and I'll make some comments on this when we talk about the SDG financing. Improving national and regional competitiveness, which we know is continuing to be a major problem, building resilience to disasters, youth unemployment. And then focusing on the vulnerable groups, and we examine that. If you look at the level of the percentage of GDP that has gone towards social protection in the Caribbean, it's very low compared to Latin America, and in fact is among the lowest in the world. And so looking at, which is by the way new, because the region used to do very well on social protection investment, so how do we address that? And finally, using some of the tools, how do we use the 2030 agenda to make some advances on these issues?